People Are Strange was perhaps the Doors' attempt to recreate the success of Light My Fire, which hadn't been intended as a hit single, but when it was edited down from its longer version, became one. So on each album from then onwards, generally the Doors would try to find something that could come out as a single. People Are Strange was a reasonably successful single, and they're perhaps on the poppier side of their music.
People Are Strange, another good song. That was another Morrison one. I believe it was based on a poem that he'd written. And it's got a neat little, some neat codas in there. And it's like so many Doors songs. When you listen to a lot of their album tracks that weren't released as singles, they really stand up on their own. And I would say definitely that's one of them. You know, another song you hear still today on the radio. And it's something I think that really draws people to the Doors. I mean, they've got some really neat things in their music, and it's like no one else at the time was doing something like that.
All right, yeah.
I heard the story that from Manzarek that Morrison was pretty depressed at the time. Went over to Krieger's house, talked about it, and I believe they went for a drive and watched the sunset. And the lyrics just came out of Morrison. People are strange.
When you're strange, faces come out of the rain. When you're strange, no one remembers your name. When you're strange, when you're strange, when you're strange.
Even the title, Strange Days or People Are Strange, I think they're stating something. Oh, this is strange. Whereas if you look at the first album, the songs just were strange, and they would use, the lyrics weren't particularly odd or strange or trippy, but the feeling on the first album was strange and unnerving. And there are good reasons for that, in as much as you stay within the pop song, but within that you make it, with the use of chords or lyrics, you make it slightly odd, slightly unnerving. The moment you sit down and say, I'm going to write a strange, trippy song, it's going to come out dated. It's going to end up sounding dated. And the problem was Morrison was encouraged in this by sort of hangers-on and so on. I think there's a point with all drugs when it starts out really, it is a revelation and things do look new and wonderful. Most drugs are like this. You have a honeymoon period and you can work on them and everything seems new to you and you can make it work with it. But then at a certain point, it starts to drag you down a bit and it loses its edge and so on. And I think that definitely happened with Morrison, and he reverted to booze, which was a disaster for all concerned, I think.
When the Music's Over is actually compared to The End, which was the last song on the first album. Again, another epic track, not as long as The End, just over 11 minutes long. The End was 11 and a half minutes. Ray Manzarek really showing his skills as playing the bass line on his keyboards. A song, you can only say that it was so full of passion and also very intense.
A fantastic Doors song, one of the best ever, in my opinion. I think what made When the Music's Over such a great song and a hallmark for the band, it's an 11-minute song, which is not out of the ordinary for the Doors, but it started what would be a long line of great album closing songs. It was one of those where they might take a few more chances in those songs, and I think, you know, for the time, and there was a lot of race riots and protest music, this is a great protest song because, as everyone knows, in it Jim Morrison screams, "We want the world and we want it now." You know, dealing with political issues was nothing new for the Doors, but I think this is one of the best examples of how they did it with a great song and a great message.
In 1968, the Doors' third album, Waiting for the Sun, came out, and a lot of people assumed that the Doors had run out of ideas by this point. This often happens with a lot of bands. Their first album will come out, great songs, their second album, and then by the time the third album comes along, they've been touring for the last 2 years. They haven't had time to sit and write, or to be playing a lot of different things and having the time to write and produce stuff. And a lot of people claim that this was the problem with this album. A lot of the songs on it tend to be maybe a little bit melancholy, but there's still some excellent music on there.
Waiting for the Sun, the Doors' third album, was probably when a little bit of backlash set in. They had been acclaimed as being fresh, new and different, but by the time of the third album, perhaps the cracks were beginning to show. They were a band that did create things together, but there was a feeling perhaps that maybe the natural linkages, the natural teamwork had run its course and that something new was going to have to come. So Waiting for the Sun was probably the first time that the Doors really copped any critical flack.
Successful with new fans. A lot of people accuse them as making an album targeted towards teeny boppers or the teen movement. A lot of hardcore Doors fans weren't happy with this, but it was still a very successful album.
Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? Hello, I love you, let me jump in your game.
The first single off Waiting for the Sun was Hello, I Love You, which came out quite a while before the album did. That's another song written on the beach in 1965. An innocent song written by Jim when he saw a girl walking past and just started singing along to himself, Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? Which he sang to the melody of All Day and All of the Night by the Kinks, which was so obvious on the record, the Kinks sued and they ended up having to pay the Kinks royalties on that song.
Hello, I love you, let me jump in your game. Girl, I want to be with you all of the time of day and all of the night.
When the band went in to record this album, they weren't really prepared. And I think a lot of fans noticed this, especially on the song. A catchy number that it is, I think fans kind of thought it wasn't their best effort, and they wrote a lot of the material while they were in the studios, whereas before they really prepared for each and every album. And I think true fans noticed that it wasn't as good as it could be, but they still liked the song.
Again, the Doors could be accused of retreading their past. In fact, in this case, they were retreading somebody else's past. But it was the hit single on the album that the Doors and their record company expected to produce each time round.
She holds her head so high, like a statue in the sky. Her arms are wicked and her legs are long. When she moves, my brain screams out this song.
The big heavy keyboard, it's just got such a beat, it just makes you want to shake your you know. It's just a great rock and roll song from the Doors. They were known for, you know, they could give you a great rock and roll song like that, but then they would do something else that was so out of left field that you'd forgotten that they were even a rock band. A song like that reminds you that, yeah, they're indeed a rock band.
Waiting for the Sun, in the eyes of a die-hard Doors fan, I think most people would agree it is among their weakest records. And I don't think that's necessarily what's included on the record. I think after two great albums in a row, Strange Days and the debut, it was almost impossible that they could live up to the bar that had been set and the standard that they had achieved for themselves. I do think it lacked some of the firepower and some of the imagery in the songs that Jim Morrison and the Doors had accomplished earlier, but I do think that it is still a decent album for sure.
Waiting for the Sun, an LP that spawned an incredible piece of poetry, Celebration of the Lizard. If you have the Foldgate, you'll see this poem. In Canada, there was a lot of albums put out, but they were just a single sleeve, and it didn't show this unless there was a slip of paper on the inside. It gave you the Celebration of the Lizard poem. This album was probably one of my favorite albums. Two other albums also very good in their repertoire of albums, but this one here did an awful lot for me.
Wait until the war is over, and we're both a little older.
The song starts off with great quiet lyrics, but then comes in with the band and a great marching drum beat.
Breakfast where the news is read,
Unknown Soldier, very popular with true Doors fans, anti-war song, which is what you wrote about in that time in the 60s. You wrote about flower power, or you wrote about anti-war demonstration.
Unknown Soldier was typical perhaps of the Doors' third album, in as much as people looked at it and said, well, it's rather too closely related to Break On Through to the Other Side. They were a four-piece band, they didn't have a bass player, they had a very specific sound. In fact, I mean, there were three pieces regards instrumentation. And because they weren't really ringing the changes at this point, people could always look at a song and see, well, maybe it's been done better or earlier on another album.
And it was very experimental in the studio too, using all of the sound effects, and you know, they actually used a rifle in the studio with blanks, of course, firing it off, and it worked. It was pretty interesting for the time.
I think the claim to fame with that song was when they performed it live, and Jim would recite the little piece of poetry in the middle bit of the song there. He would actually fall to the ground when the guns were fired. He would fall dead to the stage, and that had a pretty strong effect on stage for the time, especially given the time of the century that it was there, the late 60s.
Make a grave for the unknown soldier, nestled in your hollow shoulder. Unknown soldier.